AP 120, Chapter 15, Topics, Pharynx, Esophagus, and Stomach. So, the pharynx is a cavity or space posterior to the oral cavity. Its functions include connecting the oral cavity with the esophagus. It helps to allow for swallowing, also known as degglutination, and it prevents food from entering the nasal cavity, and also prevents food from entering the larynx, which would suck. So the oral cavity has three regions, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Only the oropharynx and laryngopharynx are part of the digestive system and are transporting food and drink to the esophagus. So swallowing reflex starts off with as we push the bolus toward the back of the oral cavity. The bolus is the term used for food that has been chewed up and mixed with saliva. So again, using our tongue, we voluntarily push the bolus toward the oropharynx. When it reaches a certain point, the swallow reflex triggers. This causes the soft palate and uvula to rise to block the nasal cavity, also causes the hyoid bone and larynx to elevate and the epiglottis to close off the larynx. So again, we're blocking off the nasal cavity and blocking off access to the larynx. And then the pharyngeal muscles will contract, pulling the pharynx upward and pushing the bolus toward the esophagus, and then the bolus will pass through the upper esophageal sphincter into the esophagus. Once the bolus is in the esophagus, then it will move down the length of the esophagus via the process of peristalsis, the muscular contractions of the walls of the esophagus that will be squeezing the bolus down to the stomach. So gravity is not needed to get food to the stomach. The esophagus, as we can see, is a straight collapsible tube that leads to the stomach. The esophagus will pass through the diaphragm in order to reach the stomach, since the stomach is in the abdominal cavity. The esophagus is posterior to or behind the trachea. It also goes behind the heart. The esophagus has part of its structure within the mediastinum of the thoracic cavity. And the four layers of the esophagus wall looks pretty much as we expect, with the mucosa, submucosa, muscular layer, and serosa. Now, the esophagus has lots of mucus glands along its length. The mucus glands, surprise, surprise, produce mucus. And the mucus helps to moisten the inner lining of the esophagus and to lubricate it to help in moving the bolus toward the stomach. At the very end, the inferior end of the esophagus, is a sphincter called the lower esophageal sphincter. This sphincter is very important. It prevents the contents of the stomach from going back up into the esophagus. We do not want that. We do not want the contents of the stomach to go back up into the esophagus. Gastroesophageal reflux disease, sometimes known as acid reflux, is when the lower esophageal sphincter frequently does not close properly. So chronic failure of the lower esophageal sphincter from closing properly. As a consequence, acidic contents of the stomach will go up into the esophagus and begin damaging the esophagus. The esophagus is not designed for the low pH found in the stomach. And that brings us to the stomach. Stomach here, as you can see, is sort of a J-shaped organ. It is in the upper left abdominal quadrant. It is important. It receives the bolus or food from the esophagus. It will then mix the bolus with its gastric juices, and this is a process of both mechanical digestion, the squeezing and churning, breaking down the size of the food particles, as well as chemical digestion because there is an active enzyme chemically breaking down proteins. And then when ready, the stomach will then propel the food from the stomach into the small intestine. When we look at the inside lining of the stomach, we see that it has all these folds and ridges. These are known as the rugae. The rugae are composed of the mucosa and submucosa portions of the stomach wall. They are important because they allow the stomach to stretch. As we know, as we eat food and swallow, the food will begin to fill up the stomach, and the stomach will stretch as it fills. You can break the stomach up into three main regions. You have this hump portion here, referred to as the fundus, so the superior fundus. The main portion of the stomach is referred to as the body. This is where most of the mixing occurs. And then the inferior portion of the stomach is called the pylorus. So this little tail portion is the pylorus, and that then leads to the small intestine. At the very end of the pylorus is another sphincter called the pyloric sphincter. This controls the release of chyme into the duodenum of the small intestine. Chyme, what is chyme? Chyme is the bolus that has been mixed with gastric juice. So you put food in your mouth, chew it up, it becomes a bolus. When it gets to the stomach, it gets mixed and becomes chyme. We look at the layers of the wall of the stomach, we see that in the mucosa layer here, it has these structures referred to as gastric pits that invaginate down into the mucosa. And the gastric pits have three types of secretory cells. It has the mucosa cells that, surprise, surprise, produce mucus. Matter of fact, the mucosa cells are all over the inner lining of the stomach, producing massive amounts of mucus. Then we also have the chief cells. The chief cells secrete an inactive enzyme called pepsinogen. However, when pepsinogen ends up in an acidic environment, it becomes the enzyme pepsin, and pepsin breaks down proteins. So the chief cells produce the enzyme that does chemical digestion within the stomach. And then finally, there are scattered in the gastric pit cells called parietal cells. And parietal cells produce hydrochloric acid. That's right, the parietal cells produce the acid in the gastric juice, giving the stomach's contents a pH of around 2, which is pretty low. And the job of the hydrochloric acid is to kill any pathogens and other bacteria, etc., that we swallowed and brought into the stomach with the food. All right, regulation of the gastric secretions. Well, to start with, it is enhanced by the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system and also by the hormone gastrin. So the stomach actually produces the hormone gastrin. Hormone will go into the bloodstream and be back in the stomach. And then the gastrin will stimulate the activities of the stomach. So parasympathetic impulses, nerve impulses, and the hormone gastrin stimulate the secretions and activity of the stomach. All right, the stomach engages in a lot of muscular contractions that lead to mixing and churning of the bolus with the gastric juice, leading to the production of chyme, this liquid slurry. This is mixing is a type of mechanical digestion. How long material stays in the stomach can vary. Fats tend to stay the longest for 3 to 6 hours before moving on. Proteins and carbohydrates are quicker than that, and water is super fast, not super fast, super fast. So when you drink some pure water, it will probably not spend much time in the stomach. Here's a little video showing the stomach in action. Looking to the body of the stomach, way down there is the pylorus. Here comes the waves of muscular contraction. It's all shiny from the mucus. Here comes another wave of contraction. way down there, that little dark hole there, that is going to lead to the small intestine. All right, so as the chyme enters the duodenum, so the stomach is ready, it sends the chyme out into the duodenum, the smallest portion of the small intestine. The secretion of the gastric juice is inhibited by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. As the chyme enters the duodenum, the fats and proteins will cause the release of a hormone called cholecystokinin. And one thing cholecystokinin does is decreases mobility in the stomach. So it causes the stomach to relax because, hey, the stomach should be empty now. And that is it for this part of the Chapter 15 lecture.